All right, let's get through this. The last video of 4.6. So monetary policy. I keep saying this, but a lot of this stuff we're going to go over in Unit 5. Unit 5 is basically a review of Units 3 and 4, fiscal policy and monetary policy. So if you're struggling with this stuff right now, just keep in mind we're doing the basics right now. Next unit, excuse me, next unit we dive into it more, and we're going to go through the examples a little bit better. All right, so the last video we talked about there's 4 different tools that the Federal Reserve uses to uh, control monetary policy. Well, this one we're going to talk about the impact of the monetary policy. So think about it on a graph. This is pretty straightforward because it's just a vertical line. It makes it really easy. Increasing the money supply will shift MS to the right. So remember, this is the number set by the Federal Reserve. So if you increase the money supply, it shifts to the right. Guess what happens if you do some kind of policy that decreases the money supply? It's going to shift to the left. And think about what policies might do these things, what might shift it one way or the other. Remember, the main tool that they're going to use is open market operations. And that's basically, they could do other ones, but that's the main one they're going to use, and that's how they can kind of create or decrease the amount of money that exists out in the economy. Remember the multiplier. Because I already mentioned it before, pretty much all of these things are going to be impacted or will impact the multiplier. So let's say the Federal Reserve buys a T-bill, a Treasury bill for $1,000, and the reserve rate is 12.5%. All right. So they create $1,000 and give it to the banks. The banks then do their fractional reserve bouncy, 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 bouncy thing. And the end up growth, the growth of M1, so not the monetary reserve or monetary base, not M0, but M1 will grow $8,000. And how can we calculate this? Well, let's bring up our calculator. So remember, the money multiplier is 1 divided by, so for every dollar, divided by the reserve ratio. Typically it's 10%, but in this example we said it's 12.5, so 12.5, that's the percentage there. So every $1 that the Federal Reserve creates, $8 will be added to the money supply, will be added to M1. Another way you can run this calculation is we can say, well, $1,000 divided by 0.225, and that should give us $8,000. So, the money multiplier itself was 8, which you then multiply by 1,000. If you want to put 1,000 over that, that will also work. So anyways, that means that the money supply will grow by $8,000. Now, let's say they buy a bill and drop the reserve ratio to 10%. So let's say they create $1,000, and because they're really worried about the economy, they drop the reserve ratio from 12.5 to 10%. Well, think about that. And once again, you just have to redo the math. I don't want to bring up the calculator again. But if you double check my math, I'm pretty sure I did it right. That will increase the money supply by $10,000. And think about why they would want to do that. Think about why they would want to increase the money supply by $8,000 or $10,000. And you're like, well, $2,000 isn't that big a difference. Obviously, these numbers are super small because I'm just giving you examples. If we're talking in the millions of dollars, right, that's millions of dollars that are now available to be loaned out and to be used in the economy. And so these are tools they can use to grow the economy. So an increase in the money supply will increase aggregate demand. So aggregate demand will shift to the right. Now, what decrease in money supply obviously would go the other way. But an increase in money supply will shift aggregate demand out this way. Because basically, and we're going to do a lot more of this in Unit 5, but the idea is that when there's more money available, there's more money to be spent, which means there is more spending, which means that demand will shift to the right. So if you are increasing the money supply, it will help inflate the economy. GDP should grow. Prices will probably go up as well too, but there will be more spending going on in the economy. Policy lag. Okay, so let's say people are starting to say like, hey, I think we're in a recession, or the economy's slowing down, or something's wrong. The coronavirus is sort of an exception where everybody immediately recognized that there was something going on, and there was a problem brewing, and unbelievably record-breaking high unemployment, all these things. That's a different case. Most of the time, when you're in a normal business cycle, and bang and bust, and you have recessionary and expansionary periods, usually you don't know exactly where you are on the graph, and we've already talked about that before in earlier units. So just like everything else, there's usually a lag, a policy lag. So the Federal Reserve first has to identify that there even is a problem before they can start talking about how to fix it and what they can do to fix it. So that's obviously an issue there. So the Federal Reserve has to identify the problem. Uh, we've talked about this before. Recessions are when the economy has been declining for two quarters. Uh, that means that half the year basically you've already been receding, and you haven't even been doing anything. So that's a problem. So first of all, it takes a while. That's a big lag. Then they have to create a plan. Are they going to do open market operations? Are they going to drop the reserve ratio? Are they going to do something else? What are they going to do to try to fix this problem? So they create a plan. Then, this is typical, politicians, Congress, and the White House tell the Federal Reserve why the plan is bad. That seems like that's silly, but that's typically what it is, because oftentimes fiscal policy and monetary policy are at odds with each other. The Federal Reserve might be saying, like, hey, we need to slow down this inflationary period, but meanwhile, a politician will be saying, no, this inflationary period's great because the economy's running hot and I want it to keep going forever, without considering that there might be ramifications to price levels and unsustainable growth. But the Federal Reserve is supposed to be the adult in the room. They're not always right, but that's the idea. So they make a plan, and then politicians will typically tell them why it's wrong. All right. Anyways, economists and politicians are usually at odds, and you got to think about it too. Most politicians are not economists. Most economists are not politicians. Well, anyways, then finally they implement a fix, and if they're lucky, the problem is still going on that they are trying to fix. Sometimes the problems, and we've talked about this before with automatic stabilizers, sometimes the problems fix themselves. But they have to implement a fix. It might be a half year, it might be 3 months, it might be a half year, it might be a whole year after the problem's actually started. We see this problem with, we see policy lag in fiscal policy, we see policy lag in monetary policy. That's just unfortunate human nature. All right, so let's look at this really quickly here. This is a nice little little chart here, which will kind of summarize up monetary policy and what the banks can do if they have a recessionary gap or an inflationary gap. So if there's a recessionary gap, what's the why? What are they trying to do with monetary policy? Well, they want to get to full employment. They want to bring the economy back up. All right. So what can they do? Well, they can increase the money supply. If they increase the money supply, we said that will shift aggregate demand. There's more money available. There's more money to be spent, more loans and stuff like that. And so the idea is that monetary policy will start growing the economy. How can they do this? Well, open market purchases, that's the main one. They can that's where they basically are creating money, buying bonds. Decreasing the discount rate, not as often. Decreasing the reserve ratio, not as often. But these are things that they can do. Impact on interest rates, and we're going to do more of this in Unit 5, but it'll decrease the nominal interest rate. Just think about it this way. They're increasing the amount of money available. That means there is more money to be lent out, which means banks aren't as stingy with it, so they don't have to charge as much on interest rates. There's more money available, so they are more free with it. They're more willing to give it out, and so nominal interest rates will decrease. What's the impact on output? Well, hopefully increase in GDP. Remember, Y is for GDP, so we're seeing hopefully a growth in GDP. Impact on unemployment. Well, hopefully unemployment rate will decrease. And impact on price level inflation. Inflation will increase. All right, so we are going to see amount of inflation because there's more money available. And prices are probably going to start going up a little bit as a result of this. So of trying to fix recessionary gaps. Oftentimes, if it's a really bad recession, you might even see deflation. So this might counteract some of that. But anyways, moving over to inflationary gaps. So what's the goal here? Well, inflationary gaps, so that's when the economy is going too high, prices are skyrocketing, we're at unsustainable growth. So what do they want to do? Price stability. They want to try to control the growth of the economy. It's saying we're growing too fast. Maybe we're way past long run aggregate supply. So how are they going to do it? Well, they're going to try to decrease the monetary money supply. Remember, this is all monetary policy. What are they going to do? Well, it's the opposite of the other one, right? So open market sales are going to sell bonds. Remember, when the Federal Reserve sells bonds, they take money out of the money supply. They're decreasing the amount of money that exists. They could increase the discount rate. They could increase the reserve ratio. These things don't happen very often. Well, what's going to be the impact on the interest rates? Well, if there's less money available, interest rates will start to increase. It will be harder to get loans because there is not as much money available. So you want to go buy your house now, and now interest rates are 10%, whereas a year before they were 3.5%. That's a reality. That's something that could happen. It's going to slow down the economy. There's just not as much money available. What's the impact on output? GDP will decrease. Right? We're slowing down the economy. Impact on unemployment. Unemployment will increase, but now keep in mind the unemployment rate might increase, but this might be meaning that mom and dad don't have to work mandatory overtime. That means that people who should have retired are able to retire. That means people that should have been in college or in high school are going back to school. So it may be returning back to a sustainable level of unemployment. Impact on price level inflation. Inflation will decrease. We're slowing down the inflationary period. So basically just creating and destroying money. That's kind of their main policy here. Oopsie doops. All right. So review questions. What happens when a central bank buys bonds? So think about that. What's going to happen? The central bank, so the Federal Reserve in the United States, for example, buys bonds. They're buying treasury bonds. Well, remember treasury bonds we said are, it could be other bonds too, but it's usually treasury bonds in AP examples. So they're buying treasury bonds. These are coming from commercial banks. The commercial banks bought them from the government. Right? And then the federal bank, the central bank, takes those bonds and they put the money, they buy the bonds, and they're doing what with the money? What are they doing? They're taking money and giving it to who? They're giving it to those commercial banks who bought, who had the government debt. So essentially the Federal Reserve is creating money to give to commercial banks. Those commercial banks now have what? Well, they have money. They have freshly printed new money. So which one of these is the possible answer here? Is money supply decreasing? Well, no, they're creating money and they're giving it to banks. So what's going to happen? Will excess reserves decrease? Well, banks just got more money. They sold something, they have more money now. No, their excess reserves are going to increase. The interest rate will increase? Well, we said before, if there's more money, what happens to interest rates? Well, if there's more money available, you're usually going to see a decrease in interest rates. The demand for money decreases. Well, central bank buying bonds, we're not talking about demand, money demand here. What are we talking about? We're talking about that vertical line. We're talking about MS. So anything that says anything about demand for money is wrong. Excess reserves are going to increase. That's what I'm going to say, and it's correct. Yay, excess reserves increase. And you can pause it and read this explanation if you want to, or go back and look at the chart and review this section. Assume that an economy has an upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve. Okay, so it's got a standard short-run aggregate supply curve. Cool. Which of the following would occur as a result of contractionary monetary policy? Ooh, contraction. Well, contraction is the opposite of expansion. So, what are we trying to do? And I'm not going to read through all these ones. Pause it, take a second, review it, go through the answers. Contractionary policy. Price level will decrease. All right, so we're trying to reduce the amount of inflation. We're trying to counteract an inflationary economy. Inflationary economy is where the price level is increasing. Contractionary policy will hopefully decrease that. Once again, go back through that chart and review all that stuff. The Central Bank of Hamsterville conducted an open market sale of existing treasury bonds. So the central bank is selling their bonds. They're selling their T-bills that they have, and they're, putting those out in the market. All right, so which of the following best describes a reason the bank would want to do that? I'm not going to read all of these ones, but we will go through the answer here. So pause this one, read it over. Once you think you have the answer, unpause it. All right, let's take a look here. So the Central Bank of Hamsterville, open market sales, existing treasury bonds. So they're selling the bonds that they have. It's going to raise interest rates, lower aggregate demand, and lower price level. Why? Why is that the correct answer? So the central bank has treasury bonds, and they're assets of the central bank right now. When they sell those treasury bonds, who gets the money? The central bank gets the money. And remember, that central bank, the Federal Reserve, is not a bank that you and I go to for loans, right? That's the bank for banks. So that money goes to their reserves. It goes to their vaults. And that money is now taken out of circulation, and it sits in their vaults until they decide that they're going to do something with that money. So what are they doing? Are they increasing the money supply or decreasing the money supply? Well, they're decreasing the money supply by selling their assets by selling these bonds and taking that money and putting it in their vaults, there is now less money in the world. So what's going to happen? Well, if there's less money, that means banks are going to have to charge higher interest rates. If you're going to go get a loan, right, they're going to charge you a higher interest rate. There's now less money available, less money to go around, and if you want that money, you're going to pay for it. You got to pay a higher interest rate. Well, what's the impact of that? Well, in raising interest rates, that's going to lower aggregate demand. Now it's harder to buy a house. It's harder to start a business. It's harder to get a loan, whatever. It's harder to do anything. And so aggregate demand will go down. We're trying to fix an inflationary problem. And that will lower the price level. As there's less economic activity, prices are not shooting ahead. Actually, they might, depending on how far they go with this, they may actually deflate the economy. And so price levels will decrease or at least stay stabilized. So, because they are decreasing the money supply, they raise interest rates, lower aggregate demand, lower the price level. Economic conditions in Fredland have caused the demand for money to increase, which has changed the nominal interest rate. Now, I'm going to stop here for a second and say, hey, I don't 100% like this sentence because it could be a little confusing, but now we're doing stuff with demand and money supply. Think about this. So the demand for money to increase, they didn't say, change along the demand curve. This is just the demand for money has increased. Remember, left is less, right is more. So what they're saying here is that this is a rightward shift of the money demand curve. They didn't say we're moving along the curve. This caused the demand for money to increase. So there is an increase in the demand for money. For whatever reason, we have shifted to the right. Maybe ATMs have shut down or something. There's no more ATMs in the world. And now if you want to have liquidity, if you want to go into the grocery store, you have to go get cash. You have to go get money. So now there's a huge jump in the demand for money. This is what's happened. So demand for money has increased regardless of interest rates. It's just increased. And so it's a rightward shift. That might help you understand this question better. If the central bank wants to counteract this change, so they want to, because what's happening is interest rates are going up now because there's a rightward shift. If the central bank wants to counteract this change, which of the following is an appropriate open market operation? So what can they do? There's a higher demand for money. Interest rates are going up. What can they do? Pause the video. And come back, and they can buy bonds, right? So they're basically just, I'm not going to read through all this one. Hopefully you guys are getting it by this point, but they can buy bonds and try to basically slow down that effect. All right, and that's where we are for here, topic 4.7. We're almost done. We're almost finished with this section. I know this one's a little longer, so I'll put off topic 4.7 for another video.